Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time, Burnside began the Battle of the Crater. Now I will finish that animation. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. The 9th Corps troops of Ambrose Burnside, who made it into the crater and just outside of the depression, were hit by infantry as well as artillery fire soon after capturing the location. The Confederates had positioned mortars with the appropriate time fuse to hit their own salient in the event that the rumors of a mine were true. Now those mortars let loose a flurry of iron and lead, forcing the blue-coated defenders to look for cover. The Confederate units that were hit by the explosion and responded to the immediate Union threat were regiments in the division of Bushrod Johnson. Johnson served most of his Civil War career in the West, but came east with Longstreet earlier that year in 1864. He had a detached relationship with his brigades, rarely visiting the front, mostly staying at his headquarters near the Jerusalem Plank Road. The commander of Henry Wise's brigade, Colonel John Good, worked to place his Virginia units to combat Burnside's soldiers, and then sent a message to Johnson to give us the benefit of his judgment. Johnson sent his aide, Lieutenant Johnny Saunders, to say that my arrangements were very good or excellent, and to hold the works at all hazards. That was the last I heard of him until the battle was practically over. The absence of Johnson didn't mend any of the rifts between himself and his subordinates. Corps Commander A.P. Hill heard the explosion and suspected its cause. He quickly got dressed and rode to where the explosion came from. He dispatched a staffer to tell William Mahone, one of his division commanders, to rush as many troops as he could spare to the northeast. Mahone took 2,000 men in an effort to save the Confederate line. Information of the explosion got to Robert E. Lee, who made his way from Violet Bank, his headquarters, to the Petersburg front. He sent a staffer ahead to count the number of Union battle flags at the crater. The staffer counted 11, signaling to Lee that the Union were there in heavy force. The sun was rising, being between 5 a.m. and 6 a.m. It was after 7 a.m. when Burnside rushed more men to the front. Zenas Bliss's brigade of Robert Potter's division was going to try to sweep north and capture the Confederate works with 5 regiments, but when the 3 regiments on the left got to the crater, the mass of humanity halted them. The 2 regiments to the right, the 2nd New York Mounted Rifles and the 51st New York Infantry, got bogged down against the handful of rebels manning the works. The 45th Pennsylvania, 58th Massachusetts, and 4th Rhode Island were told by the units in the depression to charge and capture an artillery battery, but when they left the crater, a withering fire from musketry and artillery ripped into their ranks, diminishing any chance the units had in successfully leaving the crater. Next came the order for Burnside's African American division to attack the crater. Edward Ferrero's infantry brigades formed with Joshua Siegfried's brigade in front and Henry Thomas's brigade behind them. They marched across the no-man's land between the 2 entrenchments, with officers outside the crater attempting to direct them around the crater. But it was no use. The brigade naturally maneuvered into the depression, like all the rest, where they got entangled in the growing number of soldiers living, dead, and dying in the crater. The attacking black units went into the crater with some declaring no quarter and remember Fort Pillow. By 8:30 a.m., an order came to Colonel Delavan Bates of the 30th USCT to charge toward Cemetery Hill behind the Confederate lines. It took about 15 minutes to organize 500 men for the push outside the crater. The colonel took only 5 or 10 steps before a minie-ball penetrated his skull near the right ear, passed above the roof of his mouth, and exited near his left ear. Members of his regiment put their commander on a rubber blanket and carried him to the rear, thinking him a dying man. He would survive and receive the Medal of Honor for his actions. Thomas's brigade attempted to break out from the crater as well, but they didn't make it far toward their goal of the Jerusalem Plank Road and Cemetery Hill before falling back to the crater. John Wesley Turner, a 10th Corps division commander, couldn't see any point in attacking when he viewed the scene before Ferrero's division moved in, but his commander told him that if the black troops moved forward, he should as well. Turner's men dashed across no man's land and secured a lodgment near the Confederate works, but didn't extend it to any significant degree. On the left, the last 9th Corps Brigade would make their attack, William Humphrey advanced with the artillery on the Confederate right, unleashing a horrible volley into the flank of the brigade. The New York and Pennsylvanians buckled and then fled, leaving the Michiganders to attack the crater. The 20th Michigan put up a tough fight as they sent lead into the rebels as quickly as they could, but the mass of humanity in and around the crater made it difficult to help the situation. By 9 a.m., the last of the Union assaults ended. Roughly 10,000 Union soldiers were now crammed into 500 yards of captured Confederate works. At 10 a.m., Grant wired Henry Halleck that the attack had failed. Grant then left the field to return to City Point. But the battle wasn't over. William Mahone was arriving with 2 brigades from his division to throw back the blue troops. Word came to Mahone's old brigade, now commanded by David Weisiger, that there were black troops ahead. One Virginia wrote, "When we first set out on our expedition, we did not know that we should be called about to lock horns with black troops, and that they had charged our works with the exultant cry, 'No quarter.' The information gained, a stranger would have noticed a quickening of the step, and each eye burned with a brighter glow, and each gun received a more than casual examination to see that it was properly loaded and ready for action." Another wrote, "I never felt more like fighting in my life. Our comrades had been slaughtered in a most inhumane and brutal manner, and black slaves were trampling over their mangled and bleeding forms. Revenge must have fired every heart and strung every arm with nerves of steel for the Herculean task of blood." Mahone didn't wait for all of his troops from both of his brigades to form before he ordered them to attack. Some Union soldiers, many of them black, had taken a position just outside of the crater behind some smaller earthworks. When the rebels got to them, horrendous hand-to-hand combat erupted. One Confederate described the scene. "For many minutes, which seemed like hours, amid the roar of artillery and musketry, the groans of the wounded, the prayers of the dying, and the imprecations of the living, men pierced each other's hearts and crushed each other's skulls until the place seemed a veritable hell." The Confederates pushed on to the crater, meeting resistance along the way. Numerous accounts from the Confederates and Federals testify to the brutality shown to the black troops of Edward Ferrero. At least one account relays the story of white Union soldiers who saw how the black soldiers were being killed by the Confederates, that they themselves bayoneted retreating black soldiers, hoping to get leniency from the rebels. Weisiger was wounded in the abdomen and carried to the rear. As he passed General Mahone, Mahone said, "Weisiger, you and Joe Johnston are always getting yourself shot." The expression was meant to be complimentary, but Weisiger took it as an insult and responded, "Yes, General Mahone, and if you would go where General Johnston and I go, you would get shot too." The fighting by Mahone's men around the crater took hours. Most of Mahone's men worked their way to the north end of the crater. Some stubborn Union soldiers stayed at the crater, waiting for orders to retreat. Others ran for their lives, but over 3 hours elapsed from the time Mahone's men first charged until around 1 p.m. the Alabamians under John C.C. Sanders charged. They pushed all the way up to the crater, looking inside, seeing only about 1,000 soldiers still in the depression. Some men fired their weapons into the crater, while others grabbed abandoned rifles with bayonets attached and hurled them like spears into the crater. Eventually, some rebel officers asked the beleaguered Federals if they wanted to surrender. They agreed and began to exit the crater. However, the black troops who surrendered weren't granted the same terms. As one South Carolinian wrote in his diary, "The black troops were slaughtered without mercy, we not allowing them to surrender. They huddled together in the pit formed by the explosion, and our men deliberately capped down on them and bayoneted them until worn out with exhaustion." However, some black troops were taken as captives, some survived, and some were killed while in Confederate custody. The Union High Command had long given out hope that their troops would do any good. When Meade removed to his permanent headquarters before noon, he did not bother to dispatch an aide or staff officer to ascertain the disposition of his forces. Indeed, the Army commander remained so uninformed that at 7:40 p.m. he sent a message to Burnside inquiring if the Ninth Corps still held the crater. Burnside, whose disgust with his superior overwhelmed his normal composure, tossed aside this and 2 identical inquiries without a reply, an act he later acknowledged was inexcusably insubordinate. Uncertain if either side would agree to a truce to collect the dead and wounded, a temporary armistice wasn't called until August 1st. Then, as one Alabama soldier wrote, both armies within 75 yards of each other, though invisible, now arose out of the ground as if by magic, and it seemed that the world was filled with people in a moment. The lower ranks began to collect their comrades, and even high-ranking officers on both sides came together to converse. Those included A.P. Hill, P.G.T. Beauregard, Mahone, Johnson, Archibald Gracie, Edward Ferrero, Julius White, and Robert Potter. The armistice formally ended at 9 a.m., but hostilities were delayed a little longer, while the last of the dead and dying were taken from the field. The number of casualties on both sides are hard to estimate, but some of the most commonly used numbers are the Union lost 3,800 men, with 1,400 of those casualties being captured or missing. The Confederacy lost nearly 1,500. In addition to throwing back the Union troops who broke their line, the Confederacy captured 22 Union flags and around 2,000 small arms. The Battle of the Crater sent a morale boost throughout the Confederacy, especially Richmond. After weeks of assault, Grant hadn't been able to capture Petersburg or cut off the supplies to the city. In the West, Atlanta was still in Confederate hands. The prevention of Union forces from gaining two of the most important cities in the Confederacy gave the Army of Northern Virginia more confidence in their struggle with Grant, but the conqueror of Vicksburg wasn't done with Petersburg.